What's up, folks? Nate here at Two Wheel Dyno Works, and today we are on the dyno with a good friend of mine's brand new 2025 Versys 1100. Just like the Ninja platform, they have gone away from the 1000cc displacement engines up to these 1100s now in both the Ninja and the Versys. And as we already found to be the case with the Ninja 1100s, the stock tuning that is in place on these new Versys 1100s is not great and leaves a lot to be desired. So let's just dive right into how this bike performed in 100% bone stock configuration once we were done breaking it in on our dyno, and what we're able to accomplish in terms of outright power and performance improvement with our custom ECU mapping, with no physical changes made to the bike whatsoever, and the enormous refinements we're able to make to everywhere else besides wide open throttle, because that's really what you're going to feel when you're having these bikes properly tuned. So to the tire, on pump gas, this bike put down just under 122 horsepower, 121.95, and 76.88 pound-feet of torque. And you can see down here on the bottom graph, which is the AFR, that it is quite rich at wide open throttle. In fact, there's some places right down here where you're nearly 15% richer than an optimal AFR target for this engine. Now, from a fueling standpoint, that's honestly exactly what I expected to see. Kawasaki is using the exact same recipe on this Versys 1100 that they're using on every other modern Euro 5 Plus compliant motorcycle that they've recently brought to market. The bikes run significantly richer than they need to at wide open throttle, but at light throttle and pretty much everywhere besides at the 100% throttle stop, they are using garbage narrowband O2 sensors, like the rest of the motorcycle industry with very few exceptions, that the automotive industry abandoned over 2 decades ago because they are slow and not very accurate. And these narrowband O2 sensors are set to a fixed 14.7 to 1 AFR target, which in the era of roughly E10 premium pump gas being the de facto standard here now in the US, means that the bike at all times at light throttle, or again anywhere under than wide open throttle, is running about 0.3 AFR leaner than stoichiometry, or stoich, which is really not where these bikes like to run anyway. So by doing the basics here and correcting the fuel mapping in these bikes to go ahead and get wide open throttle's AFR target to something reasonable and getting rid of the ridiculous AFR target that is used at pretty much everywhere else in closed loop, and smoothing out the ignition timing maps and going ahead and addressing this very obvious throttle limit restriction, which we'll cover more in depth here in just a second at the top end, we're able to pick up about 5 horsepower at the peak and about 4 pound-feet of torque, and it's actually closer to about 5 or 6 right here through the mid-range, around 5,500 RPM, where you're spending most of the time riding this bike. So in terms of just raw output, we've been able to make significant improvements without touching any physical components on the bike whatsoever. Now, while those outright performance improvements are awesome to see, it's honestly not what you're going to experience and notice the most once you have our custom ECU mapping flashed into your ECU for your Versys 1100. Because that's actually the least screwed up part of the equation here when it comes to the tuning on these bikes. Wide open throttle was not that far off, which is crazy to say that 15% too rich at wide open throttle can be not that far off these days, when you take a look at the absolutely terrible throttle-by-wire mapping in place on these bikes and the garbage ignition timing on these bikes. So here's what I'm talking about, folks. This is the 5th gear full throttle-by-wire table in this bike. Now, on the x-axis up there, you have percentage of requested throttle from 0 all the way over to the far right at 100, and you've got 1,000 RPM over here on the top of the y-axis down to 10,000 RPM. So full throttle at the rev limiter is down over here. Now, if we go over here and look at the values in these tables, this is the percentage of requested throttle you're getting. So if you're asking for 100% throttle, you're actually getting 100% throttle. You're getting 73% of that, 74.9% of that, 76.5% of that, etc., etc. You don't actually get 100% throttle with the stock mapping until about 5,500 RPM. And right after about 9,000 RPM, they start chopping that down to 83% of requested throttle and then 76% of requested throttle. So just by simply removing that very obvious limitation down there at the top end of the rev range and wide open throttle, you get those big top end performance improvements. But again, that's still not what you're going to notice the most once you get proper tuning in this bike from someone like us, because the rest of the throttle-by-wire mapping is the same terrible garbage that we've come and expected to see these days from a lot of manufacturers. So let's just look at this here really quick. Say you're cruising along at like 3,000 RPM. you're at very light throttle, like 0.5 to 0.8% requested throttle, you get 100% of that 0.5 to 0.8 requested throttle. So you're getting exactly what you're asking for. But then as you increase the throttle opening to say 1.3, 1.8, to 4%, to 5%, all of a sudden by the time you get to 5.5% throttle, you're only getting 43% of what you're requesting. So by the time you've moved your wrists to about 5.5%, you're actually getting about 2%, which means that there's just this big dead air happening here because you were already getting almost 2% back here. And by the time you get to 5%, nothing has changed. I truly do not understand why Kawasaki has ever chose to build throttle-by-wire mapping this way, because it feels objectively terrible. There's no way around that, and anybody that's experienced our tuning on any other modern Kawasaki knows exactly what I'm talking about. Once you get proper throttle-by-wire mapping in place, the bikes simply feel massively smoother and more responsive than they ever were previously, while also having much, much better manners when it comes to that on-off throttle transition. Now, part of that terrible on-off throttle transition, which makes it really herky-jerky as you go down to zero, then try to crack back open the throttle, is from a decel fuel cut that's in place, that's again, in place on pretty much every other modern motorcycle out there. We almost always disable it. We've done the exact same thing here on these bikes, but that doesn't solve the fundamental issue of the throttle-by-wire mapping looking the way that it does. Here's a 3D representation in the Wool tracing software of the completely bone stock throttle-by-wire mapping in full power on these bikes. By the way, every gear is the same, so I'm not going to bother going one gear to the next, because they're all identical. As you can see here, you have this literal valley in the throttle-by-wire mapping where from about 0 to just before 20%, you're just not getting what you're asking for. And then the actual ramp here is not smooth whatsoever until you get way out toward wide open throttle, and it's still unnecessarily and overly progressive right here off the bottom. This is utter garbage, and I just don't understand why the OEMs do it this way. But what we've developed looks nothing like this and feels indescribably better from an overall riding experience. In fact, I'll just go ahead and show you the 3D representation of what we've developed versus what you get from the factory. This is my nice and smoothed out progressive throttle-by-wire mapping that is what you get when you have us flash your ECU. You can see that it is a massively smoother and more progressive ramp pretty much everywhere you're looking at throughout the entirety of the rev range and throttle opening than this nonsense. You don't need to know anything about tuning to know that if your throttle response curve looks like that, it's going to feel like crap, and if it looks like that, it's going to feel massively better. Now, the other thing that I went ahead and completely overhauled here in these ECUs is the ignition timing mapping. Because honestly, I expected the worst of the worst to be the throttle-by-wire mapping. It almost always is on these modern Kawasaki's, and that's why when people have us flash their ECUs, they feel so dramatically better than they ever did in stock trim. But in this particular case, the ignition timing mapping is also arguably equally screwed up compared to the throttle-by-wire mapping. So just to make this easier to look at, I've unified all 4 cylinders into a single table here in the Wool tracing software. Now, at very light throttle here, you can see that around 4,000 RPM, you're running about 30.7 degrees of ignition timing advance, so before top dead center, which is okay, fine, whatever. But then you've got this huge transition between the 2.8 and 3.8% throttle columns there, where all of a sudden you're jumping by almost 10 degrees. Now, running a little bit less ignition timing advance on your initial throttle will help soften some of the initial throttle input, but that's in the exact same area where the throttle's already completely dead as you're trying to roll on from a throttle-by-wire mapping standpoint. So this hitch right here feels like garbage. And if you go further down in the rev range, actually higher in this case in the rev range, further down the table, things get even worse. You've all of a sudden got points down here where you're running 20 to 17 degrees of ignition timing before top dead center, which is not a lot of timing at all, at, say, what is that? About 7% throttle. And then by 9% throttle, all of a sudden, you're up into the 30s and then up into the 40s. And this ramp here makes the response of the actual engine itself feel not great. I understand what they were trying to do here by neutering the ignition timing value this much at the higher end of the rev range, which was to essentially soften the initial throttle input and try to work around the fact that the decel fuel cut on these bikes sucks and makes that initial throttle very, very twitchy. But this is an absolutely terrible way to do it, because not only do you have this huge dead spot in the initial throttle opening, you're also not getting anywhere near an appropriate ignition timing advance to get the burn to start lighting off in the engine until like 10% throttle, and then it really just kicks on you hard when you're back to something reasonable in like the upper 30s to lower 40 degrees before top dead center. Now, I've completely overhauled the ignition timing map. Just like we did with the throttle-by-wire map, I pretty much started from scratch, because what Kawasaki had in place in the light throttle portions of the rev range, and even at wide open throttle, which I'm not really going to point out because I'm not really interested in educating other tuners out there that might want to offer tuning for these bikes, it was all garbage. So with our custom ignition timing mapping in place as well, the bike simply runs smoother and arguably much cleaner throughout portions of the rev range than it ever did previously. These bikes also run a little bit on the hot side, again, for modern emissions compliance, with the cooling fans not coming on till about 100 degrees Celsius from the factory. Now, 100 Celsius isn't a terrible cooling fan parameter. There's some bikes out there still running like 105, which is just way too hot, but we do lower that to 95 Celsius for the on or engagement parameter, and then 90 for it to go off. So it's like roughly 205 and 195 for when the fan's going to come on and when the fan's going to go off, which just keeps the bike running cooler for longer. Now, there's also a speed limiter in place on these bikes, but I honestly think you're going to have a hard time ever finding it. It's way out there in like the 150, 160 mile an hour range. I'd have to look at our 6-gear pull in the dyno, see exactly where it was, but it's there, and that's dumb, so we've removed that as well. And after having spent several days with this bike now, both on our dyno and riding it around, I can tell you that it truly feels nothing like the bike did from the factory. It just runs massively smoother, stronger, and cooler now than it ever did in bone stock trim, even though we've made no physical changes to the bike whatsoever. The exhaust is still the same, the intake's still the same. From a physical standpoint, it's 100% bone stock. But we're not going to leave it that way for long. When we personally buy bikes here at Two Wheel Dyno Works for tuning development, we do it so we can go through every step of the modification process when it comes to intake and exhaust performance mods that we'd want to do, and build custom ECU mapping for all of those possible combinations so we can provide you guys that might want to buy one of these bikes and get it properly tuned with quality custom ECU mapping for those specific setups. Now, in this particular case with this Versys 1100, we did not buy it, which is rare for us. I think I've bought 16 or 17 new 25 models so far this year for tuning development, but because my good friend Dennis works just up the road from us and will have more or less constant access to this bike, and he was willing to go ahead and purchase both a slip-on and a full system for it as well, so we can develop tuning for those modifications, we're going to obviously do that, and I was okay with taking on this project for him. Now, as of the time that we're filming this video here, there is currently no full system listed for this motorcycle. There's very little aftermarket support for parts right now for the Versys 1100, but just like we found to be the case on the Ninja 1100, I am pretty darn certain that the exhaust header and the slip-on from the 1000s will fit without any issues. And I really hope that's the case, because what we've ordered is the Black Widow slip-on and their header to create a full system for this bike from a Versys 1000. And these bikes are really going to benefit from an aftermarket header, just like any other modern Kawasaki, because this is the screwed up exhaust design that Kawasaki has chosen to use on pretty much all their modern inline fours. The collector isn't terrible, the header design isn't terrible, but where it necks down to go into the collector, where they've placed the O2 sensor here, it's dramatically necked down. And this necking down of the inlet to the collector, and then the outlet of the collector being equally necked down for these new post-cap monitoring O2 sensors they have in place, just creates an enormous physical restriction to exhaust flow and overall pulse velocity. So as soon as those parts arrive from the UK, we'll obviously be posting another video showing you the performance improvements with our custom tuning in place for the slip-on and for the header. And as I've shown you before on the new Ninja 1100s, and any of the newer Kawasaki's that use the same header and collector design that they're using on this 1100, the header is really where the big performance improvements are to be had, and I'm pretty confident that we can actually get this thing up into the 140 plus horsepower range with a proper exhaust system installed and tuning in place, which would then make this a pretty sweet adventure/adventure touring motorcycle to have with that type of power on tap, and somewhere in the mid to upper 80s for torque to the tire. So this is probably the last time we'll ever actually show a video of this bike in bone stock trim on our dyno, because we'll be getting those parts hopefully within just the next week or two, and we'll be diving directly into the tuning development for those components. And we'll obviously go ahead and share that with you folks here on our YouTube channel and our Facebook page, and in some of the Facebook owner groups that we've also decided to join for these new Versys 1100s. But in the meantime, if you want our custom ECU mapping flashed into your Versys 1100's ECU, head over to twowheeldynaworks.com, purchase our Mail In ECU Flashing service on our site for $349.99, and we'll get it flashed and shipped right back out to you the very same day we receive it. The ECUs on these bikes are actually incredibly easy to access. All I've done is pulled the seat off here, and you're staring at it. It is right there in a little shroud. You just go ahead and remove this cover, pull out the ECU, unplug the connectors, and you're done. And for those of you that have any questions whatsoever about proper tuning for these Versys 1100s or our Mail In ECU Flashing service, please do not hesitate to email us at support@twowheeldynaworks.com. I personally answer any and all tech support questions we get here at the shop via email every single day that we're open, and both myself and my staff are always truly happy to help.